The gunshot cracked across the desert like a whip, and Chester Talbot's horse reared beneath him as sand exploded 3 feet from his boot. "Next one finds your heart, deputy," the thief called out, voice muffled behind a bandana, rifle steady against a slender shoulder that seemed too narrow to hold such a weapon so still. Chester dropped low behind a boulder, his own revolver drawn, sweat cutting rivers through the dust on his face. 3 days he had tracked this thief across the Arizona territory. 3 days since the strongbox had been stolen from the Prescott Bank. And 3 days since he had sworn to Sheriff Doyle that he would bring the culprit back dead or alive. "Come out with your hands up," Chester shouted, though his voice cracked with exhaustion. "There is no need for anyone to die out here." "That is where you are wrong," the thief answered, and there was something in that voice, something achingly familiar that made the hair on Chester's neck stand on end. "There is every need. You do not know what I am running from." He peered around the boulder just as the thief's horse bolted deeper into the canyon, hooves kicking up a curtain of red dust that swallowed the retreating figure whole. Chester cursed under his breath and swung back onto his own mount, spurring the animal forward into the maze of sandstone walls. The chase carried them through a narrow slot canyon where the walls pressed so close that Chester's shoulders scraped stone on both sides. He heard the thief's horse stumble ahead, heard a sharp cry of pain, and when he rounded the final bend, he found the outlaw thrown from the saddle, sprawled in the sand with the stolen strongbox cracked open beside them, gold coins scattered like fallen stars. Chester dismounted fast, revolver raised, and closed the distance in 6 long strides. He seized the bandana and tore it away to identify his prisoner. The face beneath was streaked with dust and blood from a cut above the eyebrow, but there was no mistaking the sharp cheekbones, the storm-gray eyes, the small scar at the corner of the mouth that he had kissed 100 times 2 years before. "Catherine," he whispered, the revolver trembling in his suddenly weak hand. "Catherine Hart." Her eyes went wide with a horror that mirrored his own, and for one endless moment neither of them moved, the desert wind howling between them like a living thing carrying 2 years of grief and unanswered prayers. "Chester," she breathed, and the strength that had guided a rifle so steady moments before seemed to drain from her limbs. "You were not supposed to find me like this." He staggered back a step, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes told him plainly. The woman he had planned to marry, the woman who had vanished from Prescott 2 years ago without a trace, presumed dead by every soul in the territory including himself, was lying in the sand before him wearing the guilt of a bank robbery upon her shoulders. "You were dead," he said, his voice breaking. "I buried an empty coffin for you. I wept over stones with your name carved into them." "I know," Catherine said, and tears cut clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "I know, and I am so sorry, but you do not understand what I was running from, and you do not understand what I am still running from now." Chester's hand tightened on the revolver, torn between the deputy's duty and the man's shattered heart, and in that terrible silence the desert seemed to hold its breath along with him, waiting to see which man would win. 2 years earlier, Prescott had been a town of dust and dreams, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings that promised more permanence than the frontier ever truly offered. Chester Talbot had been a young deputy then too, only 24 years old, broad-shouldered and quick with a gun but slower with words, the kind of man who let his actions speak because his tongue tangled whenever something mattered too much. He had met Catherine Hart at the general store on a Tuesday morning in April, when she had been arguing with the proprietor about the price of ammunition with a fierceness that most men in town would not have dared. She had been 22 then, newly arrived from Missouri with her widowed father, and she carried herself with an independence that scandalized the church ladies and fascinated every unmarried man within 50 miles. "You are charging double what this powder is worth," she had told the proprietor, her chin lifted, storm-gray eyes flashing. "I have shot more game with less powder than you are asking me to pay for, and I will not be cheated because I wear a skirt instead of trousers." "Chester," standing near the counter waiting to collect rifle cartridges for the sheriff's office, had laughed before he could stop himself, and Catherine had turned that fierce gaze upon him instead. "Something amusing you, deputy?" she had asked, and he remembered how his ears had burned red. "Only that you are entirely correct," he had managed, "and that I have never seen Mr. Abernathy back down from a customer before today." The proprietor, grumbling, had lowered his price, and Catherine had smiled at Chester with a satisfaction that had undone him completely. That night he had told his mother he had met the woman he intended to marry, and his mother had laughed and told him to give the poor girl at least a week before he proposed. It had taken him 3 months, not because his feelings had wavered, but because Catherine herself had needed convincing that marriage would not swallow her independence whole. Her father had been a tracker and hunter before illness had claimed his strength, and Catherine had learned from him every skill a frontier man was supposed to possess: how to read sign in dust and broken branches, how to track a wounded animal for miles across unforgiving terrain, how to shoot a rifle with an accuracy that had once won her a shooting contest against 6 men who had never lived down the defeat. Chester had not been intimidated by any of it. If anything, he had fallen deeper in love with every skill she revealed, every moment she proved herself capable of surviving without him, because it meant that, when she chose to stand beside him, she was choosing him freely and not out of necessity. "I do not need a husband to protect me," she had told him once, sitting on the porch of her father's small house as the sun set orange over the distant mountains. "I have protected myself and my father for years now." "I know," Chester had answered, taking her hand carefully as though it might startle away like a wild bird. "I am not asking to be your protector, Catherine. I am asking to be your partner. There is a difference, and I think you know it." She had looked at him for a long moment, evaluating him the way she might evaluate a trail before deciding whether to follow it, and then she had smiled that rare smile that transformed her sharp features into something achingly beautiful. "Ask me properly then," she had said, "and we shall see." He had proposed the following week with a ring his grandmother had carried west from Ohio, and Catherine had said yes with tears standing bright in her storm-gray eyes. And for 3 glorious months afterward Prescott had watched them plan a wedding that promised to be the finest the town had seen. Then, on a night in October, Catherine Hart had simply vanished. Her father had been found dead in his bed 2 days later, his heart finally giving out from the illness that had plagued him for years. But Catherine herself had left no trace behind, no note, no explanation, nothing but an empty house and a wedding dress still hanging unfinished on its hook. Chester had searched for 6 months with a desperation that had nearly cost him his position as deputy. He had ridden every trail within 100 miles, questioned every traveler who passed through Prescott, sent letters to every town from California to Texas, asking after a woman matching her description. He had found nothing, not a whisper, not a rumor, until the search had exhausted the last of his hope, and the town had quietly buried an empty coffin with her name upon the headstone so that grief might finally have somewhere to rest. Now, 2 years later, kneeling in the sand of a desert canyon with his revolver still raised and his heart torn wide open, Chester Talbot finally had his answers, and they were far more dangerous than any grief he had carried. "Explain," he said, his voice hoarse. "Explain everything, Catherine, starting with why you let this entire territory believe you were dead, and ending with why you were pointing a rifle at me an hour ago over a stolen strongbox." Catherine pushed herself up onto her elbows, wincing at the pain in her side where the fall from the horse had bruised her ribs. She studied him for a long moment, the same evaluating look she had given him on the porch 2 years before, deciding how much truth he could bear. "If I tell you," she said finally, "you will have to decide whether you are still a deputy sworn to the law or a man who once loved me enough to choose differently. I cannot make that choice for you, Chester. I can only tell you the truth and hope you choose wisely. Tell me," he said, lowering the revolver at last, though his hand did not stop trembling. "Tell me everything." Catherine drew a shaking breath and began. My father was not only a hunter and tracker, she said. Before we came to Prescott, he worked for the railroad survey teams in Missouri, and he discovered something the railroad did not want discovered. He found evidence that the surveyors were falsifying land claims, stealing property from settlers, and selling forged deeds to the railroad company for personal profit. He kept records, Chester, detailed records with names and dates and sums of money, enough evidence to send powerful men to prison. Why would that matter now? Chester asked. Your father died 2 years ago. Whatever evidence he had died with him, surely. It did not die with him, Catherine said, her voice hardening. He gave the records to me before he passed, hidden inside a hollowed Bible that I have carried with me every single day since I fled. The men responsible for that fraud discovered what he had done, Chester. They sent someone to our house that October night, someone who intended to search for those records and eliminate anyone who might expose them. I overheard them through the window before they broke inside, and I ran. Chester's stomach turned cold. You ran to protect the evidence. I ran to protect you, Catherine said, and her voice cracked for the first time. If I had come to you, if I had told you the truth, they would have killed you too, Chester, to silence anyone who might have heard what I knew. I could not bear that. I could not let you die because of my father's discovery. So I disappeared, and I have spent 2 years running from men who want that evidence destroyed and everyone connected to it dead. The desert wind picked up around them, carrying dust across the scattered gold coins that still glittered in the fading afternoon light, utterly forgotten now beside the weight of Catherine's confession. The bank robbery, Chester said slowly, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. That was not simple theft, was it? The Prescott Bank has been laundering money for the same railroad men my father exposed, Catherine said. I did not steal that strongbox for the gold, Chester. I stole it because inside that box was a ledger, a second set of accounts proving the connection between the bank and the railroad fraud. I needed it to corroborate my father's records before I could take everything to a federal marshal, who might actually believe me instead of dismissing me as a hysterical woman, making wild accusations against powerful men. Chester stared at her, at this woman he had mourned as dead for 2 years, now revealed as someone who had survived alone in hostile territory while carrying evidence that could topple men powerful enough to have her killed for it. He felt something shift inside his chest, some tectonic realignment of everything he thought he understood about strength and survival. You have been alone this entire time, he said. 2 years, alone, running, hiding, and you never once tried to reach me. I could not, Catherine said, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. Every letter I might have sent could have been intercepted. Every message could have led them straight to you. I told myself that letting you believe me dead was a mercy compared to the alternative, that grief was better than danger. I do not know if I was right, Chester. I have questioned that choice every single night for 2 years. He should have felt anger at the deception, at the 2 years of grief she had allowed him to carry unnecessarily, but instead he felt only a fierce and overwhelming admiration rising up through the wreckage of his shock. This woman had survived alone in unforgiving territory, evaded pursuit for 2 years, orchestrated a bank robbery with enough precision to escape clean, and had done it all not for personal gain, but to protect evidence of injustice and to protect him. Who is chasing you? He asked. Who broke into your father's house that night and who has been hunting you since? Catherine's expression darkened further. A man named Silas Whitmore. He owns half the railroad surveying contracts in this territory, and he has men working for him who do not hesitate to kill when money is at stake. I have evaded 3 attempts on my life in the past year alone, Chester. The most recent was 6 weeks ago near Tucson, when 2 of his men cornered me in a stable, and I only escaped because I had studied every exit before I ever slept there. You anticipated an ambush before it happened, Chester said, disbelief coloring his voice. I anticipate everything, Catherine said, and despite the exhaustion and fear etched into her features, a flicker of her old fierce pride surfaced. I have had to become someone who anticipates everything, Chester, because the alternative is death. I have tracked my own pursuers to learn their patterns. I have slept in trees more nights than I care to count so that no one could surprise me on the ground. I taught myself to read the land the way my father taught me to read animal sign, except now the animal I track is the man tracking me. Chester found himself staring at her with something he could only describe as awe, the last threads of his shock giving way to a profound and startling respect. This was not the same fragile fear he had imagined when picturing Catherine alone in the wilderness these past 2 years. This was a woman who had turned her father's lessons into a survival strategy, sophisticated enough to outmaneuver hired killers for 24 months without capture. I do not know what to do with the strongbox now, Catherine admitted, gesturing weakly at the scattered gold and the cracked wooden box beside her. I only needed the ledger inside. The gold was never my intention, but I could not risk leaving it behind for the bank to simply replace the ledger before anyone noticed it missing. I planned to return the coin once I had made copies of the ledger's contents. That is still robbery in the eyes of the law, Chester said quietly, though even as he spoke the words he felt their weight shifting beneath him, becoming lighter, becoming almost meaningless compared to everything else she had revealed. I know, Catherine said, meeting his gaze directly, unflinching despite her vulnerability. And you are still a deputy sworn to uphold that law. I will not ask you to abandon your duty for my sake, Chester. I have caused you enough grief already. If you must arrest me, I will not fight you. I only ask that you let me finish what I started first, that you help me get the evidence to a marshal who will actually listen, and then you may do whatever your conscience demands. The desert stretched silent around them, the canyon walls glowing amber in the lowering sun, and Chester Talbot found himself facing the choice Catherine had warned him about from the very beginning. He could be the deputy, dutiful and lawful, and drag her back to Prescott in irons to face charges for a robbery that would likely end with her hanged or imprisoned for years. Or he could be the man who had loved her before grief and duty had ever divided his loyalties, the man who recognized injustice when it stared him plainly in the face. He holstered his revolver slowly, deliberately, and extended his hand to help her rise from the sand. "Show me the evidence," he said. "All of it. And then we decide together what comes next, because I did not travel 3 days across this desert to lose you again the moment I found you." Catherine took his hand, her grip strong and calloused from 2 years of survival, and as he pulled her upright their eyes met with an intensity that seemed to burn away the 2 years of separation between them in a single searing moment. "Thank you," she whispered. "I did not dare hope you would still choose me after everything." "I never stopped choosing you," Chester said. "Even when I believed you were dead, some part of me refused to accept it. I think I always knew, somewhere beneath the grief, that you were too strong to simply disappear without a fight." They gathered the scattered gold coins and repacked what remained of the strongbox as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert sky in violent shades of orange and crimson. Catherine retrieved a small leather satchel from beneath a flat stone near her fallen horse, and inside it Chester saw the worn Bible she had mentioned, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed with age and handling. "This is everything my father collected," she said, opening the hollowed compartment carved into the Bible's thick cover to reveal a stack of folded papers dense with names, dates, and figures. "And this," she added, pulling free a leather-bound ledger from beneath the horse's saddle blanket, "is what I risked everything to retrieve today." Together, they prove that Silas Whitmore has been defrauding settlers and laundering money through the Prescott Bank for the past 4 years. Chester examined the documents in the fading light, his deputy's training allowing him to recognize immediately the damning weight of what he held. Names he recognized from Prescott society, Respectable men who attended church every Sunday and sat on town committees, appeared alongside sums of money that suggested corruption running far deeper than he had ever imagined possible in his small frontier town. "This could bring down half the town council," he murmured. "Whitmore has connections that reach into the sheriff's office itself, does he not? That would explain why you never trusted anyone in Prescott enough to come forward before now." "Sheriff Doyle himself may be compromised," Catherine confirmed grimly. "I could not risk approaching him, not knowing whether he was complicit or simply blind to what surrounded him. That is why I need a federal marshal, someone outside the reach of local corruption, someone who answers to Washington rather than to Whitmore's money." "There is a marshal's outpost in Tombstone," Chester said, his mind already calculating distances and dangers. "2 days' ride from here if we push the horses hard. Marshal Aloysius Grant operates out of that territory, and I have heard he cannot be bought by anyone, not even men as wealthy as Whitmore." "Then that is where we go," Catherine said, and for the first time since he had torn the bandana from her face, hope flickered bright and genuine in her storm-gray eyes. They made camp that night in a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall, the desert cold settling around them despite the daytime heat that still radiated from the stone beneath them. Chester built a small fire from scavenged brush, while Catherine tended the cut above her eyebrow with water from her canteen, her movements efficient and practiced despite the pain that occasionally flickered across her features. "You never asked me if I still loved you," Catherine said quietly, staring into the flickering fire as darkness swallowed the canyon around them. 2 years, Chester, and you never asked." He looked up from the fire, studying her profile in the orange light, the sharp cheekbones now hollowed slightly with the hardship of survival, the storm-gray eyes that had haunted his dreams every single night since her disappearance. "I was afraid of the answer," he admitted. "I was afraid that if I asked and you said no, I would lose you all over again, and I do not think my heart could survive losing you twice." Catherine turned to face him fully then, her expression unguarded for the first time since he had found her in the sand. "I never stopped loving you, Chester Talbot, not for a single day in these 2 years. I thought of you every night I slept beneath open sky, every time I evaded a pursuer, every time I nearly gave up hope of ever seeing you again. My love for you was the one truth I never had to question, even when every other certainty in my life crumbled away." He crossed the small distance between them without conscious thought, his hand rising to cup her face with a tenderness that belied his rough, calloused fingers. "Catherine," he said, her name a prayer on his lips, "I have loved you since the moment you argued Abernathy down over the price of gunpowder. I buried an empty coffin with your name on it, but I never buried my love for you. I could not, no matter how hard grief tried to convince me otherwise." Their lips met in the firelight, tentative at first, as though testing whether 2 years of separation had changed the fundamental truth between them, and then deepening as both of them realized simultaneously that nothing had changed at all, that the love they had built 2 years before had simply been waiting, patient and enduring for this exact moment to reignite. When they finally parted, Catherine rested her forehead against his, her breath still unsteady. "This complicates everything," she whispered. "I am still a wanted thief, Chester. You are still a sworn deputy. Whatever happens between us now, we cannot escape the reality of what I have done or what still haunts me." "Let tomorrow worry about complications," Chester said, pulling her against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his own. "Tonight, I only want to hold the woman I never stopped loving and trust that we will find a way through whatever comes next together, the way we should have faced everything from the very beginning." They slept close together that night, wrapped in the single blanket Chester had carried in his saddlebag, the fire burning low as the desert stars wheeled overhead in patterns as old as the land itself. For the first time in 2 years, Catherine Hart slept without one eye open for danger, trusting the man beside her to keep watch over both their hearts and their survival. Dawn broke cold and clear over the canyon, and they broke camp quickly, aware that every hour spent lingering increased the risk that Whitmore's men might discover Catherine's trail before they reached Tombstone's martial outpost. Chester examined the ground around their camp with an experienced eye, searching for any sign that they had been followed, while Catherine repacked the evidence carefully into her satchel and secured it against her body beneath her riding coat. "We should avoid the main trail," Catherine said as they mounted their horses, her earlier weariness replaced now by the sharp focus of someone accustomed to constant vigilance. "Whitmore has men watching every stage route between here and Tombstone. I know a path through the mountains that few travelers use, longer but far less likely to be watched." "You know this territory that well?" Chester asked, genuinely startled. "You have never lived in Tombstone." "I have spent 2 years studying every map I could acquire, learning every trail and water source between here and the Mexican border," Catherine said matter-of-factly. "Survival required it. I could not afford to be trapped in unfamiliar territory with pursuers closing in behind me." They rode through the morning in relative silence, Catherine leading them along a narrow path that wound between towering rock formations Chester had never noticed despite years of patrolling this general region. Her instincts proved remarkably sound. Twice she called sudden halts, dismounting to examine tracks in the dust that Chester would have ridden past without a second glance, and both times she identified signs of recent riders passing through, forcing them to adjust their route to avoid potential ambush. "How did you learn to read sign this precisely?" Chester asked during their second such detour, watching as Catherine crouched beside a scattering of hoofprints, her fingers tracing the depth and spacing of each mark with the focused concentration of a scholar studying ancient text. "My father spent years teaching me before his illness claimed his strength," Catherine said without looking up. "But necessity taught me far more than he ever could. When your life depends on correctly identifying whether tracks are 2 hours old or 2 days old, whether a rider was moving at a walk or a gallop, whether they were alone or accompanied by others, you learn very quickly or you die. I chose to learn." She rose from her crouch and gestured toward a ridge line to the east. "These tracks are perhaps 6 hours old, 3 riders moving at a deliberate pace, likely a patrol rather than pursuit specifically targeting us, but we should still avoid the ridge they were traveling toward. There is a spring 2 miles south of here where we can water the horses without crossing their likely path." Chester followed her lead, marveling at the confidence with which she navigated terrain that should have been entirely foreign to her. When they reached the spring exactly where she had predicted, hidden within a small grove of cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade from the intensifying midday heat, he found himself staring at her with an expression she caught and questioned with a raised eyebrow. "What?" she asked, checking her horse's girth strap with practical efficiency. "I am simply in awe of you," Chester admitted. "I spent years as a deputy learning to track outlaws and lost travelers across this territory, and you navigate it more surely than I ever could, despite having lived here far less time than I have." Catherine's lips curved into a small, proud smile. "Survival is an excellent teacher, Chester. Perhaps the most thorough teacher there is." They rested at the spring for an hour, allowing the horses to drink their fill and graze on the sparse grass growing near the water's edge, while Chester and Catherine shared the last of the dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebags. The desert stretched silent and vast around them, broken only by the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead in search of prey, and for a brief moment it seemed almost possible to forget the danger pursuing them both. "Tell me what happened after I disappeared," Catherine said quietly, breaking the peaceful silence. "Tell me about the search, about the funeral." "I need to understand what I put you through, Chester, even though I know it will be painful to hear." Chester was quiet for a long moment, gathering the words to describe 6 months of increasingly desperate searching, the way he had ridden himself half to exhaustion chasing every rumor and false lead, the way his mother had eventually begged him to accept that Catherine was likely dead so that he might begin to heal. I refused to believe it for the longest time, he said finally. I told myself you had simply run away, perhaps frightened by the commitment of marriage, and that you would return when you were ready. It was easier to believe that than to accept you might be dead. But as months passed with no word, no sign, no evidence of your survival anywhere, even I began to lose hope. The funeral was Sheriff Doyle's idea, he continued. He said the town needed closure, that an empty grave with your name on the stone would allow people to grieve properly and move forward. I fought against it for weeks, but eventually I relented, though I never truly believed it. Some part of me kept searching even after the headstone was placed, kept asking travelers if they had seen a woman matching your description, kept hoping against reason that you were alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Catherine's eyes glistened with tears as she listened, her hand finding his across the small space between them. I am so sorry, Chester. I never intended to cause you such prolonged suffering. I thought disappearing quickly and completely would allow you to grieve and move forward faster than if I had left some trail of hope for you to chase. You were trying to protect me, Chester said, squeezing her hand gently. I understand that now, even if the not knowing was its own particular torture. But we cannot change the past, Catherine. We can only decide what happens from this moment forward. And what do you want to happen? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper, vulnerable in a way that contrasted sharply with the fierce competence she had displayed throughout their journey. I want to bring this evidence to Marshal Grant, see Whitmore and his corrupt allies brought to justice, and then I want to marry you properly this time, with no secrets standing between us, Chester said without hesitation. If you will still have me, that is, after everything that has happened. Catherine's answering smile was radiant despite the exhaustion and danger surrounding them. I never stopped wanting to marry you, Chester Talbot. That wedding dress still hangs in my father's old house, waiting to be finished, if it has not been discovered and disposed of by now. Then we finish it, Chester said firmly. Once this business with Whitmore is settled, once you are safe and cleared of any wrongdoing, we finish what we started 2 years ago. They remounted and continued their journey toward Tombstone as the afternoon sun climbed toward its peak, the mountains ahead promising both the safety of federal law and the potential dangers of Whitmore's reach, extending even into that supposedly incorruptible territory. Catherine remained vigilant throughout the ride, occasionally pausing to study tracks or distant movement that Chester's less practiced eye entirely missed, and each demonstration of her exceptional skill deepened his admiration and love for this remarkable woman, who had survived 2 years of impossible circumstances through sheer intelligence and determination. As evening approached, they made camp in a small canyon that Catherine identified as offering natural defensive advantages, a narrow entrance that could be easily monitored and multiple escape routes should danger present itself from an unexpected direction. Chester found himself once again amazed by her strategic thinking, the way she assessed terrain not merely for its beauty or convenience, but for its tactical value in ensuring their continued survival. You would have made an excellent scout for the cavalry, he told her as they settled beside a small, carefully shielded fire that would not betray their position to distant observers. I have known men who spent decades learning skills you seem to have mastered within 2 years of necessity. Necessity is a harsh teacher, but an effective one, Catherine replied. I would rather have learned these skills under gentler circumstances, Chester, but I cannot deny that they have kept me alive when many others might have perished. They ate a simple meal of rabbit that Catherine had snared earlier that afternoon with a small trap she had constructed from wire and twine carried in her satchel, another skill that left Chester quietly impressed by her resourcefulness. As darkness settled fully around their canyon shelter, they discussed strategy for the following day, calculating that they should reach Tombstone by early afternoon if they maintained their current pace. Once we reach Marshal Grant, what happens to you? Chester asked, voicing the fear that had lingered at the edges of his thoughts throughout the day. "You are still guilty of robbing that strongbox, regardless of your motives. I do not know if federal law will look favorably upon your actions, even considering the evidence of corruption you have uncovered." "I have considered that risk carefully," Catherine said, her expression turning solemn. "I am prepared to face whatever consequences result from my actions, Chester, if it means the evidence against Whitmore finally reaches someone with the power to act upon it. I would rather face imprisonment having exposed his corruption than continue living as a fugitive while he continues to defraud innocent settlers and launder money through corrupt institutions." "I will not let them imprison you," Chester said fiercely. "Whatever influence I have as a deputy, whatever testimony I can offer regarding your motives and the circumstances that drove you to such extreme measures, I will use it to protect you." "You may lose your position as deputy for defending me," Catherine warned. "Sheriff Doyle may not look favorably upon a deputy who chose personal loyalty over sworn duty." "Then I will lose my position," Chester said simply. "I have spent 2 years mourning you, Catherine. I am not prepared to lose you again for the sake of a badge, no matter how much I have valued my service as deputy. There are other ways to serve justice than wearing that particular star." Catherine studied him for a long moment in the flickering firelight, her expression softening into something that mixed love with profound gratitude. "I do not deserve someone as devoted as you, Chester Talbot. I abandoned you to grief for 2 years, and yet you stand ready to sacrifice your career and reputation to protect me." "You did not abandon me," Chester corrected gently. "You protected me, even at tremendous cost to yourself." "There is a difference, Catherine, and I think it is time you allowed yourself to accept that difference rather than carrying guilt you do not deserve." They talked long into the night, sharing stories of the 2 years apart, Catherine describing narrow escapes and lonely nights spent watching stars wheel overhead while wondering if she would ever see Chester again. Chester describing his slow rebuilding of purpose through his work as deputy, though he admitted that purpose had always felt incomplete, missing some essential piece that only her presence could restore. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them both, and they slept close together beneath the desert stars, more at peace than either had felt in the 2 long years since fate had torn them apart. They woke before dawn the following morning, eager to reach Tombstone and finally set in motion the process that would either vindicate Catherine's dangerous gambit or condemn her to imprisonment despite her righteous motives. As they broke camp and prepared to depart, Catherine suddenly froze, her head tilting slightly as she listened to something Chester could not immediately identify. "Riders," she said quietly, her hand moving instinctively toward the rifle secured to her saddle. "Multiple riders, approaching from the north, moving fast." Chester listened more carefully and finally caught the distant sound she had identified moments before he could, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against hard-packed earth growing steadily louder as unseen riders approached their position. "How many?" he asked, already reaching for his own weapon. 4, possibly 5, Catherine said, closing her eyes briefly to focus entirely on the sound. "They are moving with purpose, not simply passing through." "I believe they have found our trail." "Whitmore's men?" Chester asked. "Almost certainly," Catherine confirmed grimly. "We need to move immediately, and we need a defensible position if they catch up to us before we reach Tombstone." They mounted quickly and rode hard along the trail Catherine indicated, pushing their horses to a pace that risked exhaustion but offered their only hope of maintaining distance from their pursuers. The sound of hoofbeats behind them grew steadily louder despite their efforts, confirming that whoever pursued them possessed either fresher horses or more intimate knowledge of the shortest routes through this treacherous terrain. "There," Catherine called out, pointing toward a rocky outcropping ahead that offered natural cover and elevated position. "We can hold there if necessary, force them to approach from a single direction while we maintain the high ground." They reached the outcropping with barely 200 yards separating them from their pursuers, close enough now that Chester could make out 5 riders, all armed, all wearing the kind of rough clothing that suggested hired guns rather than lawmen. He recognized none of their faces, but the grim determination with which they closed the distance left little doubt regarding their intentions. Catherine dismounted swiftly, pulling her rifle free and taking position behind a boulder that offered both cover and a clear line of sight toward the approaching riders. Chester positioned himself nearby, his revolver drawn, though he recognized immediately that Catherine's rifle possessed far greater range and accuracy than his sidearm for this particular confrontation. "Let me take the first shot," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the danger bearing down upon them. "I can drop the lead rider's horse from this distance without killing the man himself. That should slow their approach and give us time to negotiate or retreat further if necessary." Chester watched in stunned silence as Catherine steadied her rifle against the boulder, tracked the lead rider's approaching horse for several tense seconds, and then fired a single shot that struck the animal's front leg with surgical precision. The horse stumbled and fell, throwing its rider into the sand, while the remaining 4 riders reined in sharply, startled by the unexpected and remarkably accurate resistance. "Ease off," one of the riders called out, his voice carrying easily across the intervening distance. "We ain't here to hurt nobody unless you force our hand. Mr. Whitmore just wants what belongs to him returned peaceable." "Tell Whitmore that what I hold does not belong to him," Catherine shouted back, already reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "Tell him that the evidence of his fraud will reach a federal marshal regardless of how many men he sends to stop me." The riders exchanged glances, clearly reassessing their assumptions about how easily this confrontation would resolve in their favor. The fallen rider limped back toward his companions, cursing loudly about his ruined horse, while the remaining 4 seemed to calculate their odds against a marksman who had just demonstrated lethal accuracy at considerable range. "There are 4 of them still armed and mounted, plus the one you dismounted," Chester said quietly, his revolver still trained on the standoff. "Can you hold them if this becomes a genuine fight?" "I can hold them longer than they expect," Catherine replied, her focus never wavering from the riders ahead. "But we should attempt negotiation first if possible. I would rather avoid unnecessary bloodshed if these men can be convinced to abandon their pursuit." "You there, deputy," the same rider called out, apparently recognizing Chester's badge glinting in the morning sunlight. "You're supposed to be enforcing the law, not protecting a thief who robbed the Prescott Bank. Hand her over and we'll forget you were ever involved in this mess." "This woman is my fiancée," Chester called back, his voice carrying clear authority despite the tremor of danger running through his veins. "And the evidence she carries proves that your employer has been defrauding settlers and laundering stolen money through the Prescott Bank for years. If you value your own freedom, you will abandon this pursuit and let us pass, because federal marshals will soon be investigating every man connected to Whitmore's criminal enterprise." This declaration produced visible uncertainty among the riders, several of them exchanging glances that suggested they were reconsidering the wisdom of their current employment. The desert wind carried the tension between the 2 groups like a physical presence, thick enough to taste, as both sides calculated the risks of continued confrontation against the possibility of peaceful resolution. "We got paid to retrieve stolen property," the lead rider finally said, though his confidence had clearly diminished. "Ain't paid enough to die for it, or to end up testifying in federal court about our involvement neither." "Then ride away," Catherine called out. "Tell Whitmore his money could not buy your loyalty when the true cost became clear. We have no interest in harming any of you, only in bringing legitimate evidence of fraud to proper authorities." A tense silence stretched between the 2 groups as the riders conferred quietly among themselves, their voices too low for Chester and Catherine to make out specific words. Finally, the lead rider straightened in his saddle and called out one final time. "This ain't over," he warned. Whitmore's got more men than just us, and deeper pockets than you can imagine. You might have won today, but he won't stop coming after that evidence you're carrying." With that final warning, the riders wheeled their horses and retreated back along the trail they had arrived upon, leaving Chester and Catherine alone once again in the vast desert silence, though the threat of Whitmore's continued pursuit now hung more heavily than ever between them. "That will not be the last confrontation," Catherine said quietly, lowering her rifle at last. "Whitmore has too much invested in maintaining his secrets to simply accept defeat. We need to reach Tombstone quickly, before he can organize a more determined pursuit." They mounted their horses once more and continued their journey with renewed urgency, Catherine's earlier calm now replaced by a focused intensity that left no doubt regarding the seriousness of the danger still pursuing them. Chester found his admiration for her deepening further with every demonstration of her exceptional capability. This woman who had just faced down 5 armed men with nothing but skill, precision, and unwavering courage. By early afternoon, they crested a final ridge and saw Tombstone spread out below them in the valley, its buildings clustered around the main thoroughfare that bustled with the activity of miners, merchants, and travelers passing through this booming silver town. The sight offered welcome relief after the tension of their journey, though both Chester and Catherine remained alert for any sign of continued pursuit as they descended toward the town proper. The federal marshal's office occupied a sturdy brick building near the center of town, distinguished from surrounding structures by its solid construction and the American flag hanging above its entrance. Chester dismounted first, helping Catherine down despite her evident capability of managing the task herself, and together they approached the office with the satchel of evidence secured firmly beneath Catherine's riding coat. Marshal Aloysius Grant proved to be a weathered man in his 50s, his gray mustache and steady eyes suggesting decades of experience enforcing federal law across territories where local authority often proved insufficient or compromised. He listened without interruption as Chester and Catherine explained their story, laying out the evidence of Whitmore's fraud across his desk in careful detail, the ledger and papers creating an increasingly damning picture of corruption that had operated unchecked for years. "This is extraordinary evidence," Marshal Grant said finally, studying the documents with the focused attention of a man recognizing the significance of what lay before him. "If this holds up to scrutiny, it will implicate not just Whitmore but half the Prescott Bank's leadership and several prominent citizens besides. This could be one of the largest fraud cases this territory has ever prosecuted." "What of Miss Hart's involvement in obtaining this evidence?" Chester asked carefully. "She acquired the ledger through means that technically constitute theft, though her motives were entirely justified given the circumstances." Marshal Grant studied Catherine for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hart, can you describe exactly how you obtained this ledger?" Catherine explained the robbery in careful detail, describing how she had planned the theft specifically to retrieve evidence rather than for personal gain, how she had intended to return the stolen gold once she had extracted the necessary documentation, and how she had evaded pursuit for 2 years while protecting both the evidence and the man she loved from potential retaliation. "The gold coins are largely accounted for," Chester added, gesturing to the satchel containing the recovered currency. "Miss Hart never intended permanent theft, only temporary access to prove the fraud contained within that strongbox." Marshal Grant considered this information for a long moment, his fingers steepled thoughtfully as he weighed legal precedent against the extraordinary circumstances presented before him. "Federal law does technically require prosecution for bank robbery, regardless of motive," he said slowly. "However, given the scale of corruption this evidence exposes, and given that Miss Hart clearly acted to expose criminal fraud rather than commit theft for personal gain, I am inclined to exercise discretion in how this case proceeds." "What does that mean for Catherine specifically?" Chester asked, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. It means I will recommend to the federal prosecutor that charges against Miss Hart be significantly reduced or potentially dismissed entirely, contingent upon her full cooperation in testifying against Whitmore and his associates, Marshal Grant explained. Given that the gold has been recovered nearly in full, and given the extraordinary public interest in exposing this fraud, I believe a reasonable prosecutor will recognize that pursuing severe charges against the very person who exposed this corruption would serve no legitimate purpose. Relief flooded through Chester's chest at this pronouncement, and he watched Catherine's shoulders relax slightly, 2 years of tension beginning to ease for the first time since her father's discovery had forced her into hiding. I will need you both to remain in Tombstone for several days while I organize a proper investigation and coordinate with federal prosecutors regarding how to proceed against Whitmore, Marshal Grant continued. I will also dispatch riders to arrest Whitmore before he can flee or destroy additional evidence, though given the men who pursued you earlier today, I suspect he already knows his scheme has been discovered. We understand, Chester said. Whatever assistance you require, we will provide it fully. Marshal Grant nodded approvingly and began making arrangements for their temporary lodging in Tombstone, as well as coordinating the deployment of additional deputies to secure the town against any retaliation Whitmore might attempt before his eventual arrest. As they left the marshal's office that afternoon, Catherine finally allowed herself a genuine smile, the weight of 2 years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. "Do you believe it is truly over?" she asked Chester as they walked together toward the boarding house Marshal Grant had recommended for their stay. "Do you believe Whitmore will actually face justice for what he has done?" "I believe Marshal Grant is a man of genuine integrity," Chester said, "and I believe the evidence you risked everything to obtain will prove sufficient to bring Whitmore's corruption fully into the light. Whatever happens next, Catherine, you have accomplished something extraordinary. You exposed fraud that could have continued victimizing innocent settlers indefinitely, and you did it while evading capture for 2 years through sheer intelligence and determination." They settled into the boarding house that evening, taking separate rooms out of propriety, though both found sleep elusive as adrenaline and lingering anxiety continued coursing through their systems despite the relative safety Tombstone now offered. The following morning brought news that Marshal Grant's deputies had ridden for Prescott immediately, intent on arresting Whitmore before he could flee or organize further resistance. 3 days passed in tense anticipation as they awaited word from Prescott regarding Whitmore's arrest. Chester used the time to send a telegram to Sheriff Doyle explaining the situation, uncertain how his superior would react to learning that his deputy had essentially abandoned his official duties to protect a woman wanted for bank robbery, regardless of her justified motives. The response, when it finally arrived, surprised Chester considerably. Sheriff Doyle expressed relief that Catherine had been found alive, along with cautious optimism that the evidence of fraud might finally explain certain irregularities he himself had noticed within local banking practices, but had lacked sufficient authority to investigate properly. He assured Chester that his position as deputy remained secure, provided he returned to Prescott once the immediate situation had resolved, and offered qualified support for whatever arrangement allowed Catherine to avoid unjust prosecution. "Your sheriff sounds like a reasonable man," Catherine observed after Chester shared the telegram's contents with her over breakfast at the boarding house. "He has always been fair, even when circumstances grew complicated," Chester agreed. "I suspect he suspected something was amiss with the bank's practices for some time, but lacked concrete evidence to act upon his suspicions." On the 4th day, word finally arrived that Silas Whitmore had been arrested without significant resistance, apparently having received warning of the approaching federal deputies, but lacking sufficient time to flee before they reached his substantial ranch outside Prescott. Additional evidence discovered during the arrest, including correspondence detailing years of fraudulent land deals and bank fraud, further corroborated everything Catherine's father had originally documented. The Prescott Bank's leadership was likewise arrested pending investigation, and preliminary reports suggested that at least a dozen prominent citizens throughout the territory would face charges related to their participation in the elaborate fraud scheme. The scale of corruption exposed by Catherine's evidence exceeded even Marshall Grant's initial estimates, implicating officials as far away as the territorial capital in schemes to falsify land claims and profit from stolen settler property. Marshall Grant summoned Chester and Catherine to his office once this news had been confirmed, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who had successfully brought significant criminals to justice. "The federal prosecutor has reviewed your case, Miss Hart," he informed her without preamble. "Given your cooperation, the recovery of nearly all stolen currency, and the extraordinary public service you provided by exposing this fraud, all charges against you related to the bank robbery have been dismissed. You are free to return to your life without fear of prosecution." Catherine's composure finally broke at this announcement, tears of relief spilling freely down her cheeks as 2 years of hidden fear and constant vigilance finally released their grip on her heart. Chester embraced her immediately, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he absorbed the reality that Catherine's ordeal had finally, truly ended. "Thank you," Catherine said to Marshall Grant, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing me, for taking this evidence seriously, for giving me back my life." "You earned this outcome through your own courage and intelligence, Miss Hart," Marshall Grant replied. "I merely ensured that justice was properly served. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude for exposing corruption that would have continued harming innocent settlers indefinitely had you not risked everything to bring it to light." They left Tombstone 2 days later, the evidence properly transferred to federal custody, and the legal proceedings against Whitmore and his associates set in motion, promising months of trials that would eventually see the guilty parties properly punished for their years of fraud and corruption. Chester and Catherine rode back toward Prescott together, no longer fugitive and pursuer, but partners finally free to build the future that circumstance had stolen from them 2 years before. The journey back felt entirely different from their initial flight through the desert, the tension of pursuit replaced by a growing anticipation of the life they might finally build together. They talked freely now about everything that had happened during their 2 years apart, Catherine sharing details of her survival that she had previously withheld out of habit or caution, Chester describing more fully the depth of grief and eventual acceptance that had characterized his own difficult journey through loss and uncertainty. "What will you do now?" Chester asked as they made camp on their second night of travel, the desert stars once again wheeling overhead in familiar patterns that felt less threatening now that danger no longer pursued them so closely. "Will you remain in Prescott, or do you feel drawn elsewhere after everything that has happened there?" Catherine considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I want to remain in Prescott," she said finally. "Despite everything that happened, it remains the place where I first met you, where I first felt truly at home after years of moving from place to place with my father. I do not wish to run any longer, Chester. I wish to build a life, a proper home, with the man I love." "Then that is precisely what we shall do," Chester said, pulling her close against him as the fire crackled softly nearby. "We shall finish that wedding dress hanging in your father's old house, and we shall marry properly this time, with the entire town celebrating rather than mourning." They reached Prescott 3 days later to a reception that neither had entirely anticipated. Word of Catherine's survival and her role in exposing the territory's largest fraud scheme in recent memory had preceded them, carried by telegraph and subsequent gossip that spread through the small town with remarkable speed. Rather than the suspicion or judgment Catherine had feared might greet her return, the town instead welcomed her as something approaching a hero, The woman whose courage and sacrifice had exposed corruption that had touched nearly every family in the surrounding territory through fraudulent land dealings. Sheriff Doyle greeted them personally as they rode into town, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile as he shook Chester's hand firmly and offered Catherine a respectful nod that acknowledged the courage her actions had required. "Hart," he said formally, "the town owes you a debt that will be difficult to repay, though I suspect several families whose land claims were fraudulently altered will find some measure of justice through the ongoing investigation you helped initiate." "I only did what my father would have wanted," Catherine replied. "He discovered the fraud originally, Sheriff. I merely finished what he started before his death prevented him from seeing justice served." "Your father would be proud," Sheriff Doyle said sincerely. "As I imagine, is your fiancé here, given the risks he took to protect you and ensure justice was properly served." Chester felt his ears burn slightly at this acknowledgement, though pride swelled within his chest at the sheriff's evident approval of his actions during the entire ordeal. "Deputy Talbot," Sheriff Doyle continued, "your position remains secure, and I have already recommended you for a commendation given the exceptional judgment and courage you demonstrated throughout this entire situation. Though I suspect," he added with a knowing smile, "your priorities may lie elsewhere in the immediate future." "They do indeed, Sheriff," Chester confirmed, glancing toward Catherine with a warmth that left little doubt regarding his meaning. Catherine's father's old house had remained empty throughout her 2-year absence, its ownership technically unresolved given the circumstances of her disappearance, but Sheriff Doyle confirmed that the property remained legally hers to claim now that her survival had been officially established. They visited the house together that same afternoon, both of them uncertain what emotional weight the visit might carry after everything that had transpired. The house appeared much as Catherine remembered it, though dust had settled thickly across every surface during 2 years of abandonment. She moved through the rooms slowly, memory washing over her with each familiar sight, until finally she reached the small bedroom where the unfinished wedding dress still hung upon its hook exactly where she had left it that terrible October night. "It survived," she whispered, reaching out to touch the delicate lace that trimmed the bodice, still white despite the accumulated dust that had settled across its folds. "I feared someone might have taken it, or that time might have destroyed it entirely." "Nothing could destroy something so precious," Chester said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Just as nothing could destroy what we shared, no matter how many years or how much distance separated us." Catherine turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and reached up to touch his face with the same tenderness that had characterized their reunion in the desert canyon days before. "Will you help me finish it?" she asked. "The dress, I mean. I never learned to sew particularly well, and my mother passed before she could teach me properly." "I know nothing of sewing either," Chester admitted with a small laugh, "but I know a seamstress in town who would likely consider it an honor to help finish the dress that will finally see you married." They spent the following weeks preparing for their wedding while simultaneously testifying in the ongoing federal investigation into Whitmore's fraud, a process that occupied significant time, but ultimately proved less arduous than either had feared given the overwhelming evidence Catherine's father had originally collected. Whitmore himself, facing certain and severe punishment given the scale of his crimes, eventually confessed fully in hopes of leniency, providing additional testimony that implicated even more individuals throughout the territory's banking and land management systems. The trial proceedings, while lengthy, ultimately resulted in significant prison sentences for Whitmore and his primary accomplices, along with restitution requirements that would help compensate the many settlers whose land had been fraudulently claimed or whose deeds had been falsified over the preceding years. Justice, delayed for 2 long years by fear and necessary caution, finally arrived in full measure for all those who had suffered from the elaborate fraud scheme. Throughout this period, Chester and Catherine's relationship deepened further, tempered now by shared experience and mutual respect that transcended even the deep love they had originally shared before circumstance tore them apart. Chester found himself continually amazed by aspects of Catherine's character he had not fully appreciated during their initial courtship 2 years before. Her intellectual sharpness evident not merely in tracking and survival skills, but in the clarity with which she analyzed the legal proceedings, occasionally offering insights that even the federal prosecutors found valuable. "You should have studied law," Chester told her one evening as they reviewed testimony preparation together at her father's kitchen table, now cleaned and restored to its former warmth. "Your mind works precisely the way a skilled attorney should, cutting through irrelevant details to identify what truly matters." "Perhaps in another life," Catherine said with a smile. "Though I suspect frontier towns offer few opportunities for women pursuing legal careers, regardless of natural aptitude." "Times are changing," Chester observed. "Perhaps not quickly enough for your immediate benefit, but changing nonetheless. Who knows what opportunities might exist for our daughters someday, should we be blessed with children who inherit your remarkable intelligence." Catherine's cheeks flushed slightly at this mention of future children, though her eyes sparkled with evident pleasure at the thought. "I would be equally pleased with sons who inherited their father's steady courage and unwavering loyalty," she said. "Though I suspect any children we raise together will benefit from both our particular strengths, regardless of their gender." The wedding finally took place on a clear October afternoon, almost exactly 2 years after Catherine had originally disappeared into hiding, though this time the date carried celebration rather than tragedy. The entire town of Prescott turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church where Catherine's original wedding had been planned 2 years before, though this time no shadow of doubt or uncertainty hung over the proceedings. Catherine wore the finished wedding dress, its lace now properly completed by the town's skilled seamstress, the white fabric catching afternoon light as she walked down the aisle toward Chester, who stood waiting with an expression that mixed profound love with lingering disbelief that this moment had truly finally arrived. Sheriff Doyle stood as witness, along with numerous townspeople who had followed the dramatic story of Catherine's disappearance and eventual return with fascination throughout the preceding weeks. The ceremony itself proved relatively brief, though every word exchanged between them carried weight accumulated through 2 years of separation, and the extraordinary trials both had faced to finally reach this moment. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and celebration that echoed the town's collective relief at seeing this particular story reach its rightful conclusion. They celebrated that evening with a reception held in the town square, tables laden with food contributed by nearly every family in Prescott, music provided by local musicians who played well into the night, as the newly married couple danced beneath lantern lights strung between the surrounding buildings. Catherine, radiant in her wedding dress despite the dust and dancing that had begun to disturb its careful arrangement, could not stop smiling throughout the entire celebration. "I never imagined this moment would actually arrive," she confessed to Chester as they shared a quiet dance away from the main crowd, the music softer here at the edge of the celebration. "For 2 years, I convinced myself that survival meant sacrificing any hope of happiness, that protecting you meant accepting I would never truly have you. And yet here we are," Chester said, pulling her closer as they swayed gently to the distant music. "Sometimes the universe finds ways to correct its earlier injustices, Catherine. I believe we earned this happiness through everything we both suffered and sacrificed to finally reach this point." They settled into married life together in Catherine's father's house, which they gradually renovated and expanded as Chester's deputy salary, and Catherine's growing reputation throughout the territory brought increasing prosperity to their household. Word of Catherine's role in exposing Whitmore's fraud had spread far beyond Prescott, and several other territories began seeking her assistance in identifying similar fraudulent schemes that had proliferated throughout the frontier's rapid expansion. Catherine found herself increasingly consulted by federal marshals and territorial officials investigating suspected fraud. Her particular combination of tracking skills, strategic thinking, and intimate understanding of how criminals attempted to evade detection proving invaluable in multiple subsequent investigations. She approached this work with the same fierce competence that had characterized her survival during the 2 years of hiding, though now she operated with the full support and protection of legitimate legal authority rather than as a fugitive fearing discovery. Chester, meanwhile, continued his work as deputy under Sheriff Doyle's supervision, though his experiences during Catherine's pursuit and subsequent vindication had fundamentally changed his approach to law enforcement. He became increasingly skeptical of assuming guilt based solely on official accusations, having learned firsthand how circumstances might force otherwise honorable individuals into actions that appeared criminal on their surface, but concealed far more complex motivations beneath. Their marriage flourished in the months that followed, built upon the foundation of mutual respect and admiration that had strengthened throughout their shared ordeal. Chester never stopped marveling at Catherine's exceptional capabilities, whether she was tracking a lost child through difficult terrain for a grieving family, identifying fraudulent land claims that threatened to displace innocent settlers, or simply managing their household with the same efficient competence she brought to every challenge she encountered. One spring morning, nearly a year after their wedding, Catherine woke Chester with news that would add another dimension to their already full and satisfying life together. "Chester," she said, her voice carrying an excitement he had rarely heard from her, "I believe I am carrying our child." The joy that flooded through Chester at this announcement left him momentarily speechless, tears springing unexpectedly to his eyes as he embraced his wife with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words might have conveyed. "Are you certain?" he finally managed to ask. "As certain as I can be without a physician's confirmation," Catherine said, laughing at his evident overwhelming emotion. "But my body has shown all the signs, and I feel it, Chester. I feel our child growing within me." They welcomed their first child, a son they named James after Catherine's father, in the winter months that followed. James arrived healthy and strong, inheriting his mother's storm-gray eyes and his father's steady, patient temperament, a combination that Chester joked would either make him remarkably capable or remarkably stubborn as he grew older. Catherine proved as capable a mother as she had been a survivor and investigator, though she never entirely abandoned the skills and work that had defined her character throughout their extraordinary courtship and marriage. She continued consulting on fraud investigations even while raising James, often bringing her young son along during less dangerous assignments, teaching him from an early age the same careful observation and analytical thinking that had once saved her own life during 2 years of hiding. 2 years after James's birth, Catherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Eleanor after Chester's mother, who had passed away shortly before Catherine's return to Prescott, but who had lived long enough to hear the remarkable story of her son's reunion with his believed dead fiancé. Eleanor inherited her father's dark hair and steady brown eyes, though she quickly demonstrated her mother's fierce independence and sharp intelligence as she grew from infancy into an increasingly curious and capable toddler. The family settled into a rhythm of contentment that neither Chester nor Catherine could have imagined possible during those desperate days when Catherine had fled her father's house, believing separation from Chester represented the only way to protect him from Whitmore's deadly reach. Prescott itself continued growing and prospering, partially due to the restored faith in local institutions that followed the successful prosecution of Whitmore and his corrupt associates, a faith that Catherine's courage had ultimately helped restore. Sheriff Doyle eventually retired from his position 5 years after Catherine's return, and the town council, remembering Chester's exceptional judgment and courage throughout the entire Whitmore affair, appointed him as the new sheriff of Prescott. Catherine stood proudly beside him during the ceremony marking this new position, their two children watching as their father accepted the responsibility of protecting the town that had once nearly destroyed both their lives through corruption and fraud. "I could not have reached this moment without you," Chester told Catherine that evening, after the children had been settled into sleep, and they sat together on the porch of their now considerably expanded home, watching stars emerge across the darkening sky. "Everything I have accomplished, everything our family has built together, traces back to that moment in the desert when I discovered the thief I pursued was actually the woman I loved." "We built this together," Catherine corrected gently. "You never once treated me as someone requiring protection or rescue, Chester, even when circumstances might have justified such an approach. You respected my capabilities from the very beginning of our relationship, and that respect allowed us to face every subsequent challenge as true partners rather than as protector and protected." "I fell in love with your strength," Chester said, pulling her close against his side as the evening breeze carried the scent of desert sage across their porch. "Every skill you demonstrated, every moment you proved your exceptional capability, deepened that love rather than threatening my own sense of purpose or masculinity. I have never wanted a wife who required rescue, Catherine. I wanted a partner who chose to stand beside me because she valued what we could build together, not because she lacked alternatives." "And I chose exactly that," Catherine said, tilting her face up to meet his eyes in the gathering darkness. "I chose you, Chester Talbot, not because I needed protection or rescue, but because loving you made every difficult choice worthwhile, because building a life together offered something more valuable than the solitary survival I had mastered during those 2 terrible years apart." They sat together in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over Prescott, the town they had helped save from corruption now sleeping peacefully around them, their children safe within the walls of the home they had built together from the ashes of near tragedy and impossible circumstance. The desert that had once nearly torn them apart forever had instead become the crucible that forged their love into something unbreakable, tempered by shared danger and mutual respect, into a partnership that would sustain them through whatever challenges the remaining years of their lives might yet bring. Years continued to pass, and Prescott flourished under Sheriff Talbot's steady leadership, while Catherine's reputation for uncovering fraud and injustice spread throughout the territory, eventually leading to her informal but widely respected role advising territorial officials on matters requiring her particular combination of tracking expertise and investigative intelligence. They welcomed a third child, another son they named Robert, 3 years after Alina's birth, completing a family that embodied everything both Chester and Catherine had once feared they might never achieve during those dark years of separation and uncertainty. Their children grew up hearing the story of their parents' extraordinary courtship, the deputy who had chased a thief into the desert only to discover his believed dead fiancée, the woman whose exceptional skill and unwavering courage had exposed corruption that might otherwise have continued harming innocent settlers indefinitely. James, Alina, and Robert each inherited different combinations of their parents' remarkable characteristics, growing into capable young adults who understood from their earliest years that true partnership required mutual respect, that love flourished best when both partners felt free to demonstrate their full capabilities without fear of diminishing the other's affection. Catherine never stopped tracking, never stopped reading sign and analyzing evidence with the same fierce intelligence that had once kept her alive through 2 years of hiding. And Chester never stopped admiring these qualities, watching with pride as his wife continued proving throughout their decades together that strength and love were never mutually exclusive, that a woman's exceptional capability only enhanced rather than threatened the deep partnership they had built from the wreckage of near-tragic circumstance. On quiet evenings, decades after their dramatic reunion in that desert canyon, Chester would sometimes ask Catherine to tell their grandchildren the story of how she had once pointed a rifle at their grandfather and nearly convinced him she was a dangerous outlaw, and Catherine would laugh and tell the tale with dramatic flourish. Watching her grandchildren's eyes widen with wonder at the thought of their grandmother as a desert fugitive who had outwitted hired killers and exposed corruption that had threatened to destroy their family before it had even truly begun. And then, she would always conclude, your grandfather looked past the danger and the fear and saw only the woman he had never stopped loving, and he chose me over duty, over fear, over everything the world told him he should choose instead. That is the true lesson of our story, my dears. Sometimes love requires courage greater than any gunfight, greater than any chase across the desert. It requires the courage to see someone's true strength and choose to stand beside them, rather than trying to diminish or control that strength for your own comfort. Chester would simply smile during these retellings, watching his wife's eyes still sparkle with the same fierce independence and intelligence that had captured his heart so many years before in that small general store argument over gunpowder prices. Grateful beyond measure that fate had granted him a second chance to love this extraordinary woman properly, completely, and for the remainder of both their lives together. Their story became something of local legend throughout Prescott and the surrounding territory, told and retold as an example of how justice, love, and courage might triumph even against seemingly impossible circumstances. How a deputy's duty and a man's heart might ultimately align rather than conflict when both were guided by genuine respect and unwavering devotion. Catherine Hart Talbot and Chester Talbot lived out their remaining years together in Prescott, their love only deepening with each passing year, their partnership standing as proof that true strength in a marriage came not from one partner protecting the other, but from two equally capable individuals choosing, again and again, to stand together against whatever challenges life might present. Their desert reunion, born from chase and revelation and near tragedy, had ultimately blossomed into exactly the life both had once dreamed of building together, proving that even the darkest circumstances might yield unexpected paths toward lasting happiness, provided both partners possessed sufficient courage to seize that happiness when fate finally offered its long-delayed second chance.